Hello guys and welcome to today's video. With news of Intel's 8th generation Core chips on the horizon, I decided to make a video about the mounting pressures against Intel and the near-term difficulties that they're facing. I was hoping to have this out before Intel's announcement on Monday, and obviously that wasn't in the cards, but the content of this video is still relevant. I'll be making a separate video shortly specifically about the 8th generation Core chips like we see here. So with that, the year 2017 has not been terribly kind to Intel, and it's unfortunate to say that they seem to be reaping what they've sowed. From a fallen tick-tock strategy that no longer works to a nonsensical and overpriced X299 HEDT platform, to most importantly a competitor back on its feet in the form of AMD and Ryzen. With its only saving graces now being small clock speed advantages, small IPC advantages, and their dominating market share advantage, Intel certainly has their work cut out for them. Now, this isn't going to be a fully historical video, though we're going to look at AMD's Bulldozer architecture some to explain the landscape of CPUs that led us where we are now. If you're interested in the history of Intel against AMD, then I recommend you check out Adored TV's video on the history of Intel if you've got about a half hour to spare. I'll put a link in the description. For the purposes of this video though, we'll be staying on the near side of 2011 after AMD launched their Bulldozer family of CPUs. Bulldozer was AMD's attempt to create a strong multi-threaded CPU for the future of multi-threaded software. Now, I understand AMD wanting to make a future-proof CPU. They tend to make future-proof products, which is a characteristic that I applaud, but with FX they really misjudge things. The multi-threaded software required to make Bulldozer perform well simply did not exist yet. It wasn't even a little bit close to coming to fruition. They attempted to introduce CMT, clustered multi-threading, but unfortunately they saw no gains with it over regular SMT or simultaneous multithreading, what Intel calls hyperthreading. Here we see a block diagram of a CMT CPU with 4 modules and 8 cores. The integer clusters are the bulk of a CPU core, and the idea was that in multithreaded workloads each module could work as 2 entire cores by sharing an instruction decoder and an FPU. Problem was, if the FPU or decoder became saturated and worked too hard, then it was an immediate bottleneck that caused the entire module to perform essentially like a single core. This killed Bulldozer's performance considering the software at the time. AMD was stuck with the core of the Bulldozer architecture for 4 years from that point. By the time we made it to Steamroller and Excavator 3 years later, AMD had turned Bulldozer into a decent microarchitecture, but it was too little too late. AMD had bet on multi-threading, long pipelines, high clock speeds, and lost on it all. Bulldozer had already lost the Core i7-2700K from Intel, and even AMD's own Phenom 2 X6 from the previous generation. The strong win of the 2600K also gave merit to Intel's tick-tock strategy, though it quickly fell from grace. The ticks were supposed to represent a new process, or a fabrication process, and the tocks were supposed to represent new microarchitectures, with a new socket and chipset. Now this I didn't like from the beginning because all along it seemed like a way to squeeze more money out of people for purchasing more motherboards since they were having to change every 24 months, but if the chips were improving then I'd let it slide. The problem was that the technology did not keep improving that much, and the difficulty of producing new technology quickly caught up with Intel, as did their past desires to extract as much money from consumers as possible. Starting with Haswell in 2013, the tick-tock cycle was extended to include a tick, a tock, and a refresh, with the Haswell cycle including Haswell, Devil's Canyon, and Broadwell. This broke the tick-tock cycle as both Haswell and Devil's Canyon were on 22 nanometers and Broadwell on 14 nanometers, when, if following the previous pattern, Devil's Canyon should have been on 14 nanometers with Broadwell. The tick-tock cycle continued to slow down even further with Skylake to a new cycle Intel called Process Architecture and Optimization, or essentially tick-tock-tock-tock, with the Skylake microarchitecture including Skylake, Kaby Lake, Coffee Lake, and Cannon Lake. So what gives? Turns out that even with all of the money that Intel can afford to throw at research and development, they couldn't defy the laws of physics. It's becoming immensely difficult to create smaller transistors, and Intel is having an extremely tough time getting their 10 nanometer process to work for Cannon Lake and beyond. Remember how I said that Intel was reaping what it sowed, and this is exactly what I'm talking about. All this time, all this charade with tick-tock, and now tick-tock-tock-tock, Intel has had a very comfortable lead, and they've not felt the need to innovate. Instead, they continue their ritual of swapping out sockets, forcing people to buy new motherboards while delivering only minor performance improvements. The last worthy IPC improvement that we saw from Intel was from Ivy Bridge, a Sandy Bridge refresh, up to Haswell, resulting in an average gain of around 11%. Every other generational improvement from Intel since Sandy Bridge has been less than 6%, which is absolutely abysmal, and is proof that either Intel could not do any better, or they were intentionally not improving because of a lack of competition from AMD on account of Bulldozer, allowing Intel to make more money off of less innovation. Even the gains from Skylake to Kaby Lake, what Intel is now calling their optimization phase, which is just a euphemism for a refresh, offered absolutely no architectural gains or IPC improvements over Skylake. Ars Technica even said with identical performance to Skylake, Intel brings desktop performance to a standstill. Pretty powerful statement. The only thing that Kaby Lake offered was slightly higher clock speeds and 4K DRM video. The difference between the two performance-wise, though, was minuscule. What Intel expected least of all, however, was for their competitor to get back on their feet and step back into the game, which is exactly what AMD did with the launch of Ryzen in March of this year. Starting with Ryzen 7, AMD's new 8-core 16-thread part, and going down through Ryzen 5 and 3 in the following months, ending with the most recently launched, absolutely monstrous 16-core 32-thread Threadripper SKU, AMD has brought solid competition back to the CPU market at every single segment. R7's brought 8 cores and 16 threads to unprecedented price points for incredibly strong productivity. i5s were immediately killed as soon as the R5 line launched, offering up to 3 times as many threads for the same price. And the i3s, well, Intel killed the i3 themselves with the Pentium G4560, but if you're looking for 4 physical cores instead of 2 cores with SMT, then the R3 chips are the way to go. To top it off, the Ryzen chips match Intel's power efficiency and offer at least one SKU in each segment with better power efficiency than its direct competitor, not to mention that every Ryzen chip is unlocked for overclocking. The only 2 Intel chips I recommend since the launch of Ryzen are the Pentium G4560 at its bargain price point, and the 7700K, assuming gaming is the intended workload, because of the 7700K having stronger single-threaded performance, though the 7700K isn't without its issues. Here we see an article from PC Gamer highlighting Intel's statements to consumers to stop overclocking their 7700Ks because the chips simply get too hot, a side effect of Intel's use of poor quality thermal material in their CPUs instead of solder, which transfers heat much more efficiently. Intel is even using the same poor thermal material in their new $1,000 CPUs. Now, if you're using a 7700K at stock, it's still a fine chip and you won't run into any issues, but this whole overclocking issues really rubbed me wrong. You've got people paying hundreds of dollars for a CPU, extra for the unlocked version so that they can overclock, something that Intel's competition doesn't do, and then you also pay extra for a motherboard that has the ability to overclock. After all of that, when the product performs poorly while overclocking, the company that made it simply tells you to stop overclocking. Responses like that, and responses like an accelerated X299 platform launch, are what make people wonder if Intel can handle the pressure of once again facing a formidable opponent like Ryzen. X299 felt like a knee-jerk reaction and ended up being a pseudo HEDT platform with heavy artificial segmentation for things such as PCIe lanes and quad-channel memory, all the while being too hot and too expensive, especially when considering the motherboards. X299 also included other nonsensical things such as a 4-core 4-thread i5 on a supposed high-end desktop platform, and a blast from the past in the form of paying extra for USB keys to unlock certain RAID configurations such as RAID 1, 5, and others. I think what it comes down to is Intel tried to extend Skylake and Kaby Lake to make the platform cover both mainstream and high-end desktop, and failed to satisfy either one in a way that made sense. Now we've landed on the events of this week, where Intel has announced specs and a launch date for some of their newest chips since Ryzen, the 8th generation core chips, which I'll be doing a separate video on soon. Intel has announced increased core counts to the i5 and i7 lines, no doubt a direct response to the higher core counts of Ryzen, with the i7s now sporting 6 cores and 12 threads, and the i5s sporting 6 cores but still having simultaneous multithreading disabled, so only 6 threads. I think the core counts only moving up to 6 instead of 8 to match the R7 line is happening for 2 reasons. Firstly, Intel still has a small IPC and clock speed advantage over Ryzen, and secondly, and more importantly, Intel's continued use of monolithic dies as opposed to Ryzen's CCX construction causes Intel's chips to be more costly to produce and more likely to have defects. All this together brings me to the point that I'm trying to make. Intel has been too complacent since 2011 and has suffered the consequences of not being agile enough to respond quickly to returning competition. Repeatedly refreshing Skylake and offering virtually zero performance gains, a poor response to the 7700K heating issue, with the continued use of poor quality materials even in high-priced products, a garbled mess for the X299 platform, a continued desire to alter chipsets in what is ostensibly an attempt to sell more motherboards, and a continued pattern of charging more for locked versus unlocked CPUs. Intel is either not learning from the past, is being blatantly resistant to a changing CPU landscape, or was simply unprepared for what Ryzen brought to the table. Intel is promising an 11% increase in single-core performance on the 8700K, according to leaked slides from Intel's China presentation. If it turns out to be true, this would be the largest generational IPC improvement for Intel since Haswell over 4 years ago. And this is why we need competition in the PC hardware space, and why companies like AMD need to stay in the game. After over 5 years of stagnation and minimal improvement, because of FX not bringing any competition, we finally see Intel increasing their core count and increasing generational IPC by more than 10%. I'm going to end the video here. I thank you so very much for watching through it. I'm going to try and keep my videos closer to this time range as opposed to the 15 minutes of my first video. I like this option just because I'll be able to get more content out to you guys more frequently, and I know it's harder to listen to someone go on for 15 minutes than for however long this is going to turn out. As always, I encourage you to comment below or send me a message with any feedback you want to share. If you enjoyed the video, it would mean a lot for me if you would subscribe. I've also set up a Twitter with the handle @RationalPC_, and if you follow me there, you'll get a heads up on when new videos are going to release, and I'll probably be retweeting news that I find interesting from other content makers as well. I'll see you guys on the next one. Cheers.